Well, a lot of terrible economic news this week. No, I'm not going to talk about the Queen. I did not take off yesterday morning. I was just tired when I got home, and I didn't want to just phone something in. So I didn't talk about the Queen. Not interested in it. Even though her son, who is now the king, is a total, Klaus Schwab, Bill Gates wannabe. He's all in on eating bugs and just flattening the middle class. Yeah, but I don't want to get into that. I'm not going to talk about him. I'll talk about him later if he does something substantial. But other than that, I'm going to leave it at that. Charles III is an enemy of humanity, plain and simple. And now I'm going to move on to talking about America and our economy, which is in shambles. In Q2 of 2022, U.S. household wealth fell by about $6 trillion, I believe, which is the greatest fall on record. So household wealth has collapsed. It collapsed more in Q2 of 2022 than any quarter, during the financial crisis and the so-called Great Recession back then. But keep in mind, back then, the drop in household wealth was driven by the housing crash, largely. Obviously, stocks and bonds played a role, or well, just stocks played a role in that too. But this year, the housing crash hasn't really happened yet. Yes, it's starting. I think housing has certainly topped. A lot of people who are selling their house right now have found out it's too late. They missed the peak. They might actually have to cut the price of their home, depending on what market they're in. Inventory is surging in a lot of these hot housing markets, and so for the moment, prices are still quite high, but they're on their way down. Nevertheless, the drop in household wealth is still the highest on record, meaning American households are losing wealth at breakneck pace, and they're about to get the rug pulled out from under them, because for the average, financially stable household family in this country, the vast majority of their wealth is tied up in the value of their home. And so once the housing crash begins in earnest, we are going to see their household wealth plummet even more than what we're looking at right now, and it's already a really, really bad situation. So I don't want to say this is the tip of the iceberg, but it's going to get a lot worse from here. And remember, back in the '08 crisis, we didn't really have a serious inflation problem to worry about like we do now. And some well-respected econometricians that were cited by Zero Hedge, and again, I don't think I've talked about this. Econometrics is not real science. It is math geeks making up equations and putting numerical values to represent qualitative variables and creating these long, complex equations, which the variables themselves are often quite flawed, and then these variables stack, and they create these long equations and each little variable is incorrect in its own way to a certain degree, and so what you end up is you get a very highly distorted and completely bogus model by the end of it. At least that's my view of econometrics. So with that said, the mainstream economists believe in their equations wholeheartedly. They take these things very seriously. And according to a model that was created by I think they were Johns Hopkins professor and a couple of IMF economists, and this was published, I think, in the New York Times, a write-up of the paper, not the paper itself. The paper itself was in some economic journal. But their model shows that in order for the Fed to bring down inflation to the Fed's 2% target within 2 years, so I believe that's by the end of 2024, start of 2025, the unemployment rate would need to almost double from here. The drop-off on the supply side for so much in our economy, which partially goes back to energy. The supply of energy affects the supply of everything else in the economy. That supply side issue is so disastrous that in order for demand and supply to come back into equilibrium, the Fed is going to have to kneecap the American worker. That is the view of these econometricians. Now, do I believe that? Not based on their model, because I don't believe their models. Their models are almost never correct. They might get you kind of in the right direction, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like using a dowsing rod or reading tea leaves. It really is a bunch of voodoo magic. But the folks at the New York Times and all of the mainstream, economic halls, if you will, the places where economists gather and decide what is to be considered mainstream economic opinion, they are taking this paper seriously. And honestly, even though they try to put an exact number to it, they're not telling us anything we didn't already know. Their exact number is not going to be right. Of course, the Fed is not going to act even in the same way as they assume anyway, so we can't really falsify their conclusions, because inevitably the Fed will act differently, even leaving aside all the other variables in the model. But maybe this is significant because it shows that on a major issue, for the first time in a long time, the mainstream of economics is in line with the thinking of a lot of the heterodox folks in economics, the kinds of people who are not welcome to publish papers in the mainstream journals. Because as it stands, as I and so many other people have been talking about, we simply don't have the resources to maintain our standard of living here in the West, and therefore inflation, prices will spiral out of control unless demand is crushed. In a laissez-faire economy, this sort of takes care of itself because production precedes consumption. Your ability to consume is a product of what you produce. But in our economy, since we do not have hard money, and the money supply is not even something that is really fully comprehensible by people who study this for a living, let alone the average American or the average European. Money, also known as claims to goods produced by the economy, there's not really a direct relationship between money and what you produce. Now, for the average person, there might be, but there's also a lot of demand coming in from dark places. Yes, there's welfare, but it's not all welfare. There's just straight up government spending, and then you have banks creating money out of thin air. All of this really creates a big mess, and demand is completely detached from supply. So in order to bring down inflation, now that supply has been crushed and shows no sign of recovery because of the energy crisis at the very least, even if we could somehow coordinate all of the old supply chains, we don't have the energy to produce in the West what we once did. And in fact, it is because of our significant trade deficit with China and other nations that the United States is actually somewhat shielded from inflation. It's hard to believe for folks right now, but inflation here would be much worse if everything that we consumed, or at least, I shouldn't even say that, if we had a balance of trade, if we weren't just exporting all of these dollars and importing Chinese goods, because the cost of imports thanks to the foreign exchange markets over the past year or so. Imports on a relative basis are actually getting cheaper. The dollar has been appreciating. It's just that everything else really has skyrocketed, that we are experiencing the inflation that we are. Because yes, the cost of producing imports has gone up. The cost of importing them, itself, the importation process has gone up, and of course, transportation, distribution, all of this has gone up. Largely related to fuel, I might add. In short, the Fed is going to have to flatten the American worker in order to bring us out of this inflationary spiral. That seems to be the mainstream opinion now in economics. And even if you don't believe that yourself, people with power believe that. And they're the ones who make the decisions around here, not us. Honestly, do I think that this is directly related to employment? Do I think that you need to lay off millions of people, increase the amount of people unemployed from 6 million to 10.8 million? No, I don't think that that's the answer, because that didn't work for the Great Depression. That's why we had a Great Depression, because all of these people were just laid off and fired, rather than, taking a pay cut. Something that back then the government strongly discouraged. Herbert Hoover, he rounded up captains of industry and said, now whatever you do not cut pay. Fire people if you have to, lay them off, but don't cut their paychecks. And the result was the greatest depression in American history. And so, no, I'm not going to say that we need a Great Depression 2.0 in order to solve the inflation crisis. What we need to do is control the money supply, but the problem is the Fed, at least maybe they know internally, but they certainly haven't revealed to us publicly what the actual supply of money is. The Fed also hasn't demonstrated any real ability to control directly the supply of money. That's the issue here. Money supply growth. If they could nip that in the bud, maybe you wouldn't have to lay off all these people. Maybe they take pay cuts. Sure, that would be fine. Taking a pay cut is, especially if the price of everything else is going down, that's not so bad. Getting fired, losing your job, ending up on the streets, that is bad. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.